Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. As a follow up to yesterday's discussion, where we discussed the need for us to let our light shine, consider the words of the Hebrew writer in a context which he's already, the last several verses, he's addressed the fact that the brethren, the Jewish brethren to whom he's writing, they were willing to endure great persecution earlier, before. And he encourages them to continue to be willing to do that. Here in verse 36, or verse 35 rather, therefore do not cast away your confidence, which has great reward. The term confidence also means boldness, and it's their willingness to stand for the truth, even in the midst, knowing, in the midst of persecution, knowing full well that they're going to receive pushback and suffering because of it. But notice what he says. He says, which has great reward. Okay. Then in verse 36, he says, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. Now, there's parallel here, verse 35 and 36. He says, and he brings up a quality, a characteristic of endurance. And he says, do not cast away your confidence. Boldness, endurance. Endurance is the inner quality that produces patience. It's the willingness to bear under adversity, under trials, so that after you've done the will of God, so having that boldness, having that willingness to endure, fulfilling the will of God, you may receive the promise. Well, just as he said, the great reward, which is the home of heaven, the eternal life, that promise that he brings up is parallel to that great reward. And the wonderful thing about what the Hebrew writer does here, of course, kind of the backdrop of Hebrews is there's a lot of Jewish brethren who are turning away from Jesus and going back to the old law. And the Hebrew writer's writing this letter to the remaining faithful brethren of the Jews who have experienced these brethren falling away and whose confidence perhaps has been shaken, and who might be kind of waffling between going back to the old law versus staying with with Christ and that conviction in Jesus. And so the Hebrew writer is writing these things to shore up their confidence, their boldness, to shore up their assurance that what they're doing is right, and they need to continue to be willing to suffer even at the hands of their own countrymen because of their faith. And then in verse 37, he quotes Old Testament, for yet a little while, and he who is coming will come and will not tarry. That goes to show that connection back to the promise and the great reward that he referenced earlier. And of course, this is describing the return of the Lord, the coming of salvation unto heaven, or into heaven. And then in verse 38, now the just shall live by faith, but if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Now, the just shall live by faith is referenced several occasions in the New Testament, but I think it's important to note that the just being described here, this is the component of those who follow God's will. So once again, you have a parallel of here in verse 36, so that after you've done the will of God, well, doing the will of God, those are the just. The just, being just, is doing what's right, okay, following the standard of what's right. Being justified is the one who is the authority acknowledges that you have done what's right. And that's why God is the one who justifies. The just shall live by faith. And of course, the idea of faith is not just belief, it is belief that then propels one to obey. It is conviction. And that's what pistis is. That's what that term faith means. It's not just I believe, therefore I obey. And it is that conviction, that persuasion that leads one to do what God says. Therefore, the just shall live by faith. The just won't live by the law. No law offers forgiveness. Law defines right and wrong. It doesn't allow for forgiveness. That's why Jesus was necessary. But if anyone draws back, and here's what's interesting, if anyone draws back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Draws back from what? Well, draws back from being just, living by faith. And if anyone draws back, if anyone goes back and isn't being just and living by faith, my soul has no pleasure in him. Which is to say that God does not approve of that person. So then in verse 39, but we are not of those who draw back to perdition, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. Now there's a clear comparison here in verse 39 regarding individuals who have gone back to the old law. Verse 39, we are not of those who draw back to perdition. This term perdition means ruin, and it carries with it a sense of everlasting ruin, of eternal ruin. And of course, you compare that with the great reward and the receiving the promise. This carries with it the understanding of the exact opposite of what that eternal home in heaven is all about. Those who draw back to perdition are those Jewish brethren who've gone back to the old law. And the Hebrew writer is encouraging the remaining brethren, saying, we're not like them. We are not of those who draw back to ruin and the loss of our soul, those in whom God says he has no pleasure in them, but of those who believe to the saving of the soul. This term believe here is our same term that is translated into Greek in verse 38. From Hebrew, from the Septuagint, verse 38, by faith, by pistis, is what's being described here. But we are of those who have that conviction, same term. We are of those who have that persuasion. We are of those who not only believe, but obey to the saving of the soul. And I think all of this is particularly applicable given what we talked about yesterday, and the great, I say, this persecution, this wave of anti-religion. We talked about how that religious faith is rapidly falling, at least in terms of how people value it and prioritize it over the last 25 years. And of course, this is in our society. And again, every society, every age has been just as evil as the one before it and the one after it. It's not really all that different from anything else that people have lived through the ages. But we're living in this age. And the fact of the matter is, at least in our society, in Western society, we are facing pushback, and we're facing increased hostility against not only religion, but more specifically being Christians. And as a result, I think this is particularly applicable because here's the Hebrew writer writing to these Jewish brethren who themselves are facing persecution from their own countrymen. And he's encouraging them to remember your reward. Don't cast away the boldness to stand for the truth and to do what's right. Remember the promise of God. You need to endure, to bear under what you're facing, because God has promised that he will come. And when he does, he will have pleasure in those who follow after him and will not have pleasure in those who draw back. And thus this final encouragement. We're not like those who draw back, who wilt under pressure and under persecution and hardship. We are of those whose conviction and persuasion propel us to the saving of the soul, because we're willing to do what God says. All right, that's the devotional for you today. Lord willing, our next devotional will be on Thursday. I hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.